Welcome back, everybody. And today we're going to be speaking with Christopher Jones again. I've asked Christopher to come back. Well, we kind of discussed it after the last talk we did. It would be good to follow up with a more in-depth discussion on the lines. It's something that particularly interests me, so I thought it'd be really good to ask Christopher back to expand upon that. So, I mean, no need to go into any detailed background about who you are. Please visit our previous talk, which I think was about maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago. Time goes so quick,
Yeah,
it's difficult to remember. But
July the 17th it was.
okay,
We
I
recorded it.
encourage people to go back and watch that previous talk. Highly interesting, and that will give you all the background on Christopher. And yeah, so over to you, Christopher. Wherever you want to start, it's a massive field, and we're not going to get that much done, but we'll do as much as we can in a given time. So, any way you particularly like to start on the lines, or just maybe just give a general overview, just to get people.
Yeah, look. It's a really good call that you've asked me to come back to talk, Andrew, and I just want to say thank you for doing so. Um, and the reason for that is because obviously it's the lines of the hand that are most fascinating to people. I mean, they are fascinating. I mean, like, and as soon as anybody starts studying hand reading, they kind of go, oh, look, lines. And the really funny thing, I think, the really funny thing about the lines on the hand is that no one's ever noticed them. It's like, well, at what point did you kind of go, oh my God, I've got lines on my hand? And when you had that moment, how many decades was it before that you had never noticed? You've had your hands, you've been using your hands all this time. I mean, I know for me, until I first started looking at hand reading, till I met a hand reader, you know, I hadn't looked at them. I didn't know. And there's that phrase, oh, I know him like the back of my hand. It's like, well, do people really know people like the back of their hand or even the front of their hands? I mean, it's like, it's an interesting thing that although they're very apparent and technically one must have seen them during one's life because you can't not look at your hands. You've washed your hands so many times. It's amazing how much one hasn't noticed the lines of the hands, and I think that's kind of the first thing that's kind of sort of outrageous about the lines is they're like, oh my God, I never even noticed they were there. I mean, people don't know their fingerprints either, but I mean, but they've never looked at them probably, but they do know about them because of digital IDs and going through customs and things like that these days, and opening your phone. People know about fingerprint patterns. That they've got them, and they know they're all unique. But what they don't know is they don't know about the lines. And the interesting thing about the lines is, I think one of the reasons why people don't know about the lines is because there's so much negative press about the lines of the hand, which is essentially probably 800 years or at least 500 years old, and certainly 200 to 300 years old with the rise of the sort of scientific paradigm. And what's interesting about that is because of the way that the association, I think, between the lines and this notion of prediction or fortune telling from the lines of the hand, which is kind of a prevalent notion even amongst many palmists, practicing palmists around the world, that you can look at the lines of the hand and make predictions from them. And because science did the rise of science from the 17th century onwards did such a good job of replacing the sort of magical, superstitious worldview that had prevailed prior to the 17th century. Like if you look at the 17th century, astrology was studied in universities. Astrology was intimately bound up with medicine, and I mean, and in Indian traditions like the one you studied, they are part and parcel of one another. They haven't separated out in that way. But in European traditions, there was this kind of big movement to move away from what was considered to be superstitious or occult. And do you get this? So alchemy was really big, astrology was really big, chiromancy was really big in the 17th century. And then astrology became astronomy, Isaac Newton. Alchemy became chemistry, and then hand reading, chiromancy, just fell off the radar completely. And so it's an interesting thing when you study the history of these subjects. Is like there were no books, literally no books in European languages, written or printed on hand reading between about 1680 and about 1840. It's like there's absolutely nothing. I mean, there might be one or two, but basically there is no. There's this huge gap. There's this kind of, it's almost 200 years where there's no discussion of hand reading in European traditions at all. And when hand reading was really kind of invigorated in the middle of the 19th century by Casimir d'Argentigny. He was a French soldier who had his hands read by a gypsy in Spain. That's how the story goes, and that inspired him. And he was the one who started chirognomy, which is looking at like the knuckles and the fingers and the fingertip shapes. And he was the first one to develop a kind of a hand-shaped classification based upon the shape and the form of the hand. So he was mainly interested in the morphognomy, which was a big thing in the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was this massive drive to try and to measure everything. The rise of science was like measuring. They had a subject called anthropometry, which is measuring the body and proportional bodies. And then and out of that came things like phrenology, and chirognomy was part of the same description of, if we look at the physical body of the person, maybe that can tell us something about them. And that's a common thing to do. We do that all the time. One of the ways in which they discovered Down syndrome was precisely because of that. So they would go to lunatic asylums and they would look at all the people that had been locked up in Bedlam, all of these places in London, and they go, oh, look, that one looks like that one, and that one looks like that one. So they'd look for physical characteristics, and they'd be trying to understand the sort of psychological condition of the person or the mental health issue of the person by looking at their physical body, because they had that understanding that the physical body must relate to that. And they could see that there were patterns, and obviously Down syndrome has very characteristic physiological features, and so they were able to recognize that particular trait because of the characteristic physical form. And I kind of think it's really important to understand this is before psychotherapy. This is before Freud, So Freud doesn't write about interpretation of dreams, I think, till 1899 or something like that. So there's no awareness of the unconscious or the subconscious or anything like that. They don't have the language of that. It hasn't been invented yet, if you like. And so they're trying to understand the physiognomy of people. I mean, it's the same thing for the impetus behind fingerprint studies as well. Is that the fingerprints classification was done by Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and so that part of the evolutionary biology perspective was why they were looking at fingerprints and comparing the fingerprints of human beings to anthropoid apes, which is why the simian line, which we'll probably talk about shortly, where the single line across was called the simian line, because it was considered to be an atavistic or regressive line formation, because it's found more commonly in the hand of anthropoid apes and less commonly in the hand of human beings. So it was seen, that means you're more ape-like. I mean, it's quite a derogatory way of thinking about it, and I try and avoid using the name simian line, but it is the line that stuck. But interestingly, it's not a palmistry name. It's a materialistic evolutionary biological name developed by the scientists who are investigating the physiognomy of the human being in relationship to mental conditions and mental disease. And that's, again, the interesting thing when it comes to the Down syndrome thing, is that the simian line is incredibly rare in the hands of most people. It's about 1%, maybe 2%, but it's 55 to 60% of Down syndrome people have the simian line formation. So there is a characteristic formation, but that name comes from that. But what's interesting about that is that's the first scientific recognition that the lines have any value at all. And that's, when you study the medical scientific literature of fingerprint patterns, which literally are the digital patterns and some of the palmar patterns too, they always say, and then we found a very high incidence of simian lines. Not that simian lines is not part of the study of dematic lithics proper. The simian line is the most studied line of all the lines in the entire hand, because it so commonly occurs in conditions like Down syndrome, Edwards and Patau syndrome, Cri-du-Chat syndrome, which are all very strange chromosomal abnormalities. I mean, trisomy 21 is Down syndrome, is trisomy 13, trisomy 9. I mean, they've got technical names, but there's literally hundreds and thousands of research papers done by medical geneticists, by scientists investigating the dematic lithics, the fingerprint patterns associated with it. But they couldn't ignore the fact that it's got this simian line. Simian line is so strong. And it was so prevalent and so common that they had to kind of include it in their observations. And yet they kind of go, well, it's not really dramatic because it's a line. And as we know, the lines are just creases, so it's not really important. But nonetheless, it is statistically incredibly pertinent because 55% of people with Down syndrome have this line. And so they couldn't ignore it. I'll probably come back to that later because that's a really important point about, what we do know about the significance of the lines. People, when they were investigating those things, so the whole revival of palmistry in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, that sort of time, which culminated in people like Cairo and William Benham, who were the most famous palmists of the 19th century, the Chirological Society, which was founded in 1889, they took their knowledge of the lines of the hand from the Renaissance and medieval traditions. So they took that from a much earlier point of view, and they didn't really know what they meant, and so they kind of just took on board those ideas, which is why you find a lot of the ideas in those books are the same, because they basically just copied them. They just copied them, and everyone's been copying them since. But nobody ever asked the question, what are the lines of the hand? Nobody asked that question at that time. They just kind of assumed that they were there. And I think that's the kind of, I think that's in investigating the lines of the hand, I think that's the first question we have to ask ourselves, like, what are they? I mean, we know that they're there, but how are they there? Why are they there? What's the purpose of them? Is there a purpose of them? I mean, it's, Aristotle asked that question. He asked that in his book, De Historia Animalium. It's the first written record that we know of somebody looking at the lines of the hand. It was written in 345 BC. That's quite old. And he doesn't interpret the lines of the hand. He just asks the question,
just observation.
Why is it that people who are long-lived have one line or two lines going right across the hand? Like he's talking about the transverse lines. He's not talking about what they call the lifeline. He's talking about the transverse lines. And that tradition that Aristotle starts back then is replicated in the 13th century, in the 15th century, in the 17th century, and somehow by the 19th century gets lost. Because, just to go through the names of the lines, that's in traditional palmistry, that's the lifeline here, that's the headline across there, and that's the heart line up there. So what Aristotle is talking about is the length of the headline, maybe the length of the heart line, but definitely the length of the headline. He's not talking about the length of the lifeline when he's reporting this question. Why does the length of the line show someone who are long-lived and people with short lines are short-lived? It's important to think he doesn't answer that question. Anyone who says Aristotle studied hand reading is mistaken, badly mistaken. There are no treatises, there's no lectures, there's no notes, there's nothing. There's just this one question in one book. Saying,
is it grouped in with any other study? Is it just a hand, or is he looking for other? Is he saying yes, this person has a long line, but they may have a crease here? Or
no. He's talking about hooves, hands, and wings. He's talking about the appendages of different animals. De Historia Animalium, the story of animals. So why do animals do this? Why do they have wings? Why do human beings have hands? Why do those hands? Why are they divided into sections like that? And then why do they have lines? And he's only asking the question. He's like saying, it's like a provocation for further discussion, but he doesn't actually discuss it. Not that we have any record of anyway. So it's absolutely untrue that Aristotle studied hand reading or knew anything about hand reading. I mean, it's a claim that can't be verified in any kind of way. So it's fairly pointless to say it at all. And because the evidence we do have doesn't suggest he knows anything about it, because you might have said, if he did, he might have gone, and while we're at it, while this line here and that line here and the rest of it, he doesn't expand on it at all. He just asked the question. What I think is hilarious, given the preoccupation that palmists have with how long you're going to live, they talk about it in terms of the relationship to the lifeline, what they call the line of life. And that is not the palmistry tradition. The palmistry tradition is very clear in the 13th century, 14th and 15th century, that the length of life, if it's to be seen anywhere, is to be seen in the transverse lines, not in the thenar crease.
Okay, interesting.
So there's something got lost somewhere along the lines, and
that's a big loss, isn't it? That's amazing.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's exactly. It's quite a significant misapprehension. but it's become but it's logical if you think about it, because if this is called the lifeline, then the length of this line must show the length of your life. I mean, that's the kind of fallacy that's been perpetuated there. If you look at the lines in a certain kind of way, that's going to be determining what you see in them. I'm going to bring up an illustration, but just to give you an example, I know you've seen this illustration before because you've put it on other ones with Johnny, I think. This is from Jean Belot, who's a French chiromancer from the 17th century, and you can see that all these different names that he's got on here: maladie d'esprit, blessé, cowardice, incest, sodomy. So it's got various markings that show various pleasant and unpleasant things happening to the person. Ligne mensale, ligne naturelle. I think that one says the card is upside down. Anyway, the name. This wasn't the one I was going to show you. The one I was going to show you is. Right, so this is the one I wanted to show you, because in reference to the conversation that we're talking about. So this is the earliest. This is the earliest European text on hand reading. It dates from 1160. It was written in the back of a psalter, which is like a sort of a monastery prayer book, at Canterbury Monastery in 1160. This drawing is from a later edition of the same work, so this is from about 1292. So this is 730 years old, something like that, this drawing. It records what they understood the lines to mean and what they understood the lines to be about. And that's what's interesting about it, because what they were concerned with finding signs and symbols in the hand. So particularly they were concerned with what they called the Great Triangle, and then they were also concerned with things like crosses as well. And when you understand, I'm going to flip that around, because I think the other way around is slightly better. Yeah, there we go. You can see the triangle better, more clearly marked on the right hand. So the Great Triangle was formed by the lifeline, the headline, and what is called the Mercury line by many people. So you've got the Mercury line there. So the first thing that's interesting about that is, so they look for the Great Triangle. And the reason they look for the Great Triangle was because the triangle was a sign of the Holy Trinity. So you have God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. So they basically were looking for that symbol because they would be an indication that you were blessed by God. So if you had a clear triangle in your hand formed by those lines, it would show God was on your side. And they alluded to scripture. They used, it's very common in all the books up until the 17th century, where they use Job 37:7, and they say, which is a quote from the Bible in the Old Testament of Job, which says, "He sealeth up the hand of every man, so that every man might know his works." So the viewpoint in this form of chiromancy was the lines are put there by God. Therefore, they are marks of God. They are the signs of God. And if God has put the sign of a triangle in you, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, then you are blessed. So the most important thing we need to look for is the triangle. I mean, if you look at your own hand, you might have one there, you might not. But what's important to notice is that the Great Triangle doesn't involve the three main lines. The three main lines in the hand are the lifeline, as we know, the headline going across there, and the heart line, or the water line, going there. If everybody has those, apart from people with similar lines, and we'll come back to them, apart from people with similar, everyone has got those three lines. Those are the three primary lines. No, not according to medieval chiromancy. The three most primary lines, the most important lines, are these three. And what's most important is whether they join together down here and make a triangle or not. And if you have the triangle there, then you're blessed. if it's open at one end like it is here, that basically means you're going to lose all your possessions. You're going to get things stolen from you, presumably because there's a gap. So that means things can get out. I think that all your blessings will escape through this portal here. I think that's what they mean by that. But it's an imperfect triangle, therefore you're not blessed. Or maybe that meant this is a time when they didn't have house insurance. So if your house caught fire or people stole stuff from you, that was it. You were destitute. So having a well-formed triangle is the most important thing. But clearly, there's no logic to that. They're not the three most important lines. They're not analysing the actual. I mean, as you can see from the drawing, they're not actually very good at observing hands. Well, it's a very disproportionate relationship between the fingers and the palm. If you found a hand like that, with that proportion of very long palm and very, very short fingers like that, that would be a congenitally mentally handicapped person. People with severe congenital mental disorders, or they're basically probably anencephaly or something like that. There would be people with no cognitive function because the fingers relate to the mind and the palm relates to the body. But you can see that in the examples of people with those conditions. So this is not an accurate drawing. It's not accurate. It's not only not an accurate drawing, it's not even an accurate observation. As I said, it's not an observation of the three main lines. They're looking for other things. They're looking for signs and they're looking for symbols. And so the other signs and the symbols that they look for are things like crosses. I'll just clear those, go to another drawing, slightly later one, but it's got these drawings, but it's got these on it. This is MS Deuce. This is a manuscript from the 15th century, so it's slightly later.
That's a much more sort of classical kind of hand drawing, isn't it? I mean, I associate that very much like the hand of Fatima, isn't it? It's got that very sort of balanced, straight.
Well, it's a better drawing, but again, it's not accurate. Look at the length of the little finger. I mean, that's the paucity of observation here is extraordinary. That the little finger is never that big. They're disproportionate. I mean, it's a better drawing than the other one. I grant you, it's an improvement, but really, it's still not. I mean, all they had to do was get a pencil and draw around their hand. I mean, it's not that complicated. That hadn't even occurred to them either. But then the hand shape is not important to them. Okay, so morphognomy isn't important. And that's so. This is. They don't have any study of the shape or form of that. They don't even talk about mounts in this time. Mounts comes much later. This idea of the mounts being important is a much later thing. What they are concerned with is shapes, and this is true for Indian palmistry. It's true for medieval chiromancy, because of this view of what the hand shows us. God has left his mark in us, and because he's left his mark in us, he tells us what's in our fate, what's in our destiny, what's in store for us, and whether it's a good fate or a bad fate. And so you can see it, all of them. There's a cross here, there's a cross there. So the crosses are bad. Why is the cross bad?
That's strange. You think that would be a good symbol?
Yeah, but look, think of Christianity. What happened on the cross? Jesus died on the cross. So wherever you see a cross in the hand, that's going to show you how you're going to die. The cross is not a good sign, according to them, because of their perspective. Because they're taking this signs and symbols approach. They're coming from a theological viewpoint where they're looking at God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, and Jesus was crucified on a cross. And so they are looking for symbols that kind of relates to that. I mean, this happens in indigenous Chinese palmistry as well, where they would look at. I mean, in Chinese palmistry, they're looking at things like that, and they consider them to be like I Ching trigrams. So they basically, if you think about the I Ching and you throw coins or throw yarrow sticks and you get your broken lines or your full lines, they're looking for that in exactly the same way. Look, that's a perfect example right there of three lines, and then they'd find another one and there's three vertical. I mean, I don't know how to do Taoist chiromancy from 15th century China at all. I've never done it, never studied it, but that's what they look for, because that's their metaphor.
Yeah, the trigrams and hexagrams, isn't it? So like that would be like the three exactly lines, three in lines, and exactly. So it's two lots of two trigrams put together to make a hexagram. Exactly. Is there a trident? To the left of those. Oh, sorry, to the right.
I can see that trident. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. I don't know what that means because it's in Latin. but the point is this. The point is this. This is they look for these things because that's the viewpoint that they have. You know, that's the way that they see things. They understand they because their perspective is coloured by Christianity and the theology of Christianity. They're looking for theological symbols in the hand. You know, and they, because they have this view that the lines in the hand are put there by God, because it says so in the Bible. I mean, you have to remember that the Bible was the dominant book in Europe until the beginning of the decline of the Catholic Church. You know, the Catholic Church had complete intellectual power over the entire European continent until the 15th century. The Renaissance is the beginnings of the breaking away from the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church. So everything, the whole universe, all the universities, they started as part of churches, you know, monasteries and things like that. So the first colleges at Oxford were monastic colleges. You know, the earliest colleges is from about 1160 as well, I think, the 12th century. So this you know, this is the worldview that they're in. So this tells us nothing at all about the hand. What this tells us about is their worldview. You know, again, look at your own hand. You can see the three main lines. There's one. That's one of them there. That's another one there, and that's according to them, that's the third one there. I mean, those aren't accurate. They're not accurate representations of the three main lines, and yet the three main lines occur in just about everybody's hands. You know, it's very rare that they don't, but they're not interested in that. They're interested in whether, can you see these circles on here?
Yeah, yeah.
They're one of my favorite. They're one of my favorite ones. That's a feature of the hand, the story of which gets repeated for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is a text from the 15th century. It's still in the books in the 17th century. And what it means is, if you have a circle on your line of life, it means one of your eyes is going to get poked out.
God.
And if you have two of them, it means both your eyes are going to get poked out. So bad luck you. But that's, you know, because it's a circle, so it looks like an eye, so it can't be good. So therefore, I mean, who knows what the logic of it is.
And this is very much more in line with the kind of Indian tradition, isn't it? We were saying last time, you know, that whole interpretation of symbols predates, or is much more important than the line work. So it looks like the two traditions have got a similar approach to looking at the hand. Yeah,
but the similarity is because of two things. You know, Indian culture traditionally is incredibly fatalistic. You've got the caste system, it's completely immovable. You cannot change caste. This stuff is developing in feudal Europe, which has a different kind of political hierarchical structure that's equally inflexible. If you're born a serf, you die a serf. You know, if your lord wants you to go to war, you go to war, and you're probably going to die in a battle because you've got a cross in the plain of Mars. You know, that means you're going to die in a battle. You know, or if you've got a cross down here, you know, on the Mount of the Moon, you're going to die on the boats because you're going to drown. You know? Yeah. So that's basically how they interpret it. The cross is a sign of death, and where it will tell you how you would die. So if it's, you know, as I said, if it's in the main plane of Mars, it's in the battle, and if it's in lunar, in the water, you're gonna die by drowning. But this approach is to do with the way that both cultures, both Indian culture and European culture at that time, had a very rigid sociology, had a very rigid societal structure that was governed by a certain people, where life was nasty and brutal and short, and it was very predetermined. Like, what you were born into is what was going to happen to you, and there was no choice about that. And I think this notion that, you know, hands to do with prediction is a product of two things. One, it's a product of this theological view that the hand is marked by the gods or God, depending on your worldview, and therefore that's a sign of what God has got in store for you, but as a function also of the sort of lack of flexibility in society, and therefore a sense that everybody had that life happened to them, and there was no sense of agency about that. And I think so they're product of both of those things, really. I mean, and it's particularly true when you get to I'll just show another picture. when you get to things like oh, this is again,
Yeah, anatomically a bit
this is
strange.
another 15th century manuscript. It's not actually, no, this is a bit earlier. This is a third. This is a 14th century copy of the Edwine Psalter manuscript we were looking at before. But this whole preoccupation with these little markings uh, all along here, like that sort of thing. Again, in the hands of women, what was really important, of course, was how many babies you were going to have. I don't know if we've got an example of that. Yeah. Okay. So let's take the marriage lines that they called marriage lines in palmistry, aren't they? Those ones there. All right. So in these texts, they do talk about, oh, and if you've got certain lines here, it shows you're going to be married in this kind of way. If you've got this is going to show the number of sons, this is going to show the number of daughters, this is going to show the number of wives you have. So they do go into that in quite detail in the 15th century. But that's because it's really important.
Mm,
If you're a woman, you have no economic value at all unless you can reproduce.
mm,
What is your fertility?
mm,
How many heirs are you going to produce? How many vitally strong sons that can work on the land are you going to make? We don't want these daughters. They require a dowry, and you have to get rid of them. But these sons would be much more useful. So the fact that hand readers, chiromancers in those days were concerned with that, because that was a very legitimate concern of women, even up until Jane Austen's time, into the 18th century. I mean, the whole novel Pride and Prejudice is about the fact that, the father's died and the mother's got three daughters, and if she doesn't get them married, they're all going to end up in the workhouse. Because that
mm,
was, even in the 18th century, that's what the role of women in society was. If they didn't get married, they weren't good for anything else, basically. So they couldn't. Their only function was reproduction, and that's really important to remember that, in the 15th century, I mean, the life expectancy, as discussed in these texts, they basically say they describe 15 as middle-aged.
mm.
They're all about the sociology of the day, and when you look at this, and what's important about studying the history of this is that, because all of this stuff has ended up in Victorian palmistry.
Right.
They didn't know anything about lines, so they took it all from what they found in these old books, and they just assumed, oh, it's old esoteric knowledge, so therefore it must be really good. So, and you've got, in the 19th century, you've got Madame Blavatsky starting the Theosophical Society, you've got Mesmer doing hypnotism, you've got laudanum going around, so people getting stoned on opium and going, whoa, man, look at the fairies. And they're having a great time exploring these things. Freud is talking about dreams and sexuality and the unconscious. And there's this kind of whole exploration that's going on into the hidden and the unconscious. And the corollary of that is the hidden and the occult. And the Theosophical Society, Blavatsky's society, kind of really opened the Pandora's box on all of that. And they were, they hosted Swami Vivekananda coming across to Europe and giving talks and presentations on yoga and stuff like that. So when Buddhism came to the attention of Europeans in about 1860.
Mm.
So these notions, this Eastern mysticism idea is very, very prominent. So when they started writing about hand reading, we better find the mystical origins of that. And so they started telling stories about Aristotle and Robert Flood and Paracelsus, and we've got this esoteric tradition of palmistry that we've got, and it must mean something. Let's invoke Kabbalistic ideas and put them on the hand. So that's Debord who did all of that. And so there's this sort of fascination with this magical worldview that they feel like is lost knowledge. They would have done much better to have reinvented themselves in that sense, because all they've done really is taken a medieval viewpoint into the 20th century, and that's why I always say about people think about hand reading. When people hear about palmistry, they say it's to do with fortune telling and prediction and how long you're going to live and how many babies you're going to have. Well, yes, it was in the 15th century. So they got a view of hand reading that's literally 500 years out of date, and because of the disparagement of hand reading, particularly from the 17th century onwards, nobody really investigated it any further. And so this sort of stigma against hand reading still prevails even today. It's not. I mean, I'm not saying this is a 20th century problem. This is a contemporary problem. People still have huge problems apprehending that the hand can be any significance at all. And that's kind of one of the reasons why my book is on the fingerprint patterns, because it's like, well, no, you understand the fingerprint patterns. That one's accepted. You know, there's no problem about that. You know, you've got them. You know they're unique, and you know they're different to you. So let's build we use that as a platform for building a sort of a new colorology, if you like, based upon something that's actually demonstrable and actually provable, actually replicatable. Let's borrow from the medical dermatoglyphic knowledge and apply that to the hand as best as we can. Let's use forensics and anthropology and the genetic material. What does that tell us about what can we learn from that about fingerprint patterns? And so that's kind of, I think, is a very firm basis for that. But the problem is that people are still really attached to this old view, and they can't see that the handreading could be anything else. And you know, that's been the story of my involvement with handreading, and anybody who's seriously doing handreading is, well, no, it's a valuable diagnostic tool, whether it's a sort of medical approach like the way that you do it.
Is there anything on there that you can say there is a really strong tradition and that line has always been associated with it? It's never very, so everything's up for grabs here. We've got nothing that's really absolutely set.
Well, apart from those two circles, meaning you're getting your eyes poked out, that's absolutely guaranteed. That's been verified for 700 years. So that's conclusive. Exactly. Amazing. I think they might have meant islands, but for goodness sake, everybody had. If you look at the lines, there's islands all over the place. But I think they meant, they don't say that, they say circles. But literally, that is repeated again and again and again. It's even in Aristotle's masterpiece, which is a fraudulent book, not by Aristotle. There's a chiromancy in that, 1684. It's actually a book on midwifery, and funnily, it's one of those funny things. It's very bizarre. Here it is. It's a tiny little book that I've got.
Wow.
The funniest thing about this particular book, and this is really, really funny. This is like uncannily, weirdly funny. When I started doing hand reading in '83, I went to my dad's house and I noticed this book. My dad, this used to belong to my dad. I have no idea why he has this book. It's a book on 17th century medicine and midwifery, in the back of which happens to be a chiromancy, claimed to be a chiromancy written by Aristotle, and there's plenty of people, including William Benham. William Benham includes it in his book too. So I read it in Benham's book, and then I went to my dad's house and found he actually had a copy of the book. That was kind of like one of those bizarre, like, how on earth did that happen? You know, like, it's so weird.
Is it illustrated?
Yeah. It's got a diagram of those two circles.
Well, it's got the circles,
showing the getting your eye poked out. So it's so that's 1684, and the one I showed you before was like 13th century. So that's that's like 500 years. You know, and so no, it's not true. You know, and the problem with it is Andrew, the problem is really it's a problem of the change in perspective. You know, if you look at astrology in the 17th century was very, very different from as it's been done in the last 100 years. And the part of that function is, you know, in Renaissance and times, the astrology was the most important subject you could study. So this is the reason why astrology is associated with hand reading. Astrology was associated with medicine. Astrology was associated with everything. You did everything with astrology. I mean, Newton was an astrologer as well as an astronomer. You couldn't be an astronomer without being an astrologer, and in fact, you couldn't be an astrologer without being an astronomer either, because you know nobody had ephemeris back then. You had to go and look at the stars and see where they were in the sky and calculate your charts from that. But astrology in those days was not about individuals. And it couldn't be about individuals because you couldn't do birth charts for individuals because nobody knew what year they were born, let alone what day they were born, and certainly not what time they were born. So you couldn't do individual charts. So they had a very different approach to doing astrology, which particularly with someone like William Lilly and Nicholas Culpeper, they did it for herbal medicine. You know, they would do what they called decumbeture charts. They would take a chart for the moment when the person became ill and then use that to work out the remedies that they should give them. I mean, that's something that Dylan Warren Davis has done a lot of study on, and he's a sort of contemporary expert on that particular field. But he's brought that together, combined study of astrology and hand reading and his knowledge of herbal medicine. But that's what they were doing. That's what William Lilly and Nicholas Culpeper were doing. And if you look at Culpeper's herbal, you know, every single plant in there is classified astrologically. And so you know how to apply it because of the astrological portents in that way. But that's not how astrology is done now, except
No.
by people like Dylan. In contemporary time, from Alan Leo onwards in the 1930s, you get the psychologization of astrology, and then you get in the 60s, um, you get people popular psychology comes in. People start doing psychotherapy. I mean, people like Liz Green is a Jungian psychologist, and so she brings a sort of psychological flavouring to the approach to charts. And so charts are now about individuals and your personal psychology and your personal self development. That's very much a flavour of how, of a product of the time. And arguably handreading could be argued to be the same. It's about looking at the individual, and so in that kind of way, and what the psychological patterns of the person are. But so what I'm trying to say is, what you see in a hand is determined by the sort of framework that you are looking at it from.
Mm.
So let's go back to those pesky scientists, because they are, yeah. Well, they are. They're pesky, but they're quite good in their peskiness. Hang on, I'll just get another one up. This is what you would call the medical names, or the genetic names, or the scientific names for the lines of the hand. And I mean, there are scientific studies that have been done on the hand, and to name the hand and identify the positions. I mean, in a much broader way than just the Simian line, which we talked about before. But these are very kind of factual names. So the thenar, I've changed the wording slightly. They call it the thenar crease, and then lower transverse crease. But that's a pejorative term which I'm going to address in a moment. So the thenar line is the one around the thenar eminence. The upper transverse line and the lower transverse line, well, they're the ones that traverse the hand, so that's fairly obvious.
Yeah.
So the girdle of Venus will be the distal transverse line, because it's at the distal end of the hand. And that's a proximal ulnar line, and the fate line, or the Saturn line, or the minor Earth line is called the longitudinal line. So I'm ruminating about this, because I'm thinking, actually, this is actually quite a useful way of actually looking at naming the lines of the hand, because because if you look at any different palmistry traditions, they'll agree about which are the main lines are, and those are the 7 main lines that are viewed, but everyone's got a different name for them. So it gets really confusing. I mean, I don't even know the Vedic names for the lines, how you call them, but it's getting really, really confusing. And what's problematic about them is that they're all a function of the framework that's being used to interpret the lines, shall we say, rather than a functional description of where they are. And I'm beginning to get inclined that this actually might be the best way to go forward.
To use the medical terms you feel are more, because it's more kind of because it's clearer. They're just kind of breaking it down into actual where they are positioned on the line, relative than tying them to a specific kind of an energetic. They're not saying like or a line. It's better just to say that it's related to that part of the hand.
Yeah, you're on the right lines. That's exactly kind of what I'm thinking, because it just might actually be kind of easier to
I mean, I've got a bit of a job to translate between, although I like all and I use the element stuff, because the way you've designated some of the elements are different to it's really confusing for me, because some overview where everyone could agree on it would actually be pretty useful.
Well, exactly. And then what that does then, Andrew, is it separates the facts from the interpretive methodology. So you've got a particular language or symbolism or framework or paradigm, the Ayurvedic one, that you use to interpret the features. I use the 5-element perspective, and someone else might use the astrological names. And obviously some people use the medieval chiromantic Roman Catholic theological viewpoint, it's a way of kind of separating the two out from what the lines actually are, to the perspective that you're using for interpreting them. I mean, and then that also applies scientifically as well. So One of the biggest problems that we have with the scientific view of the hand is that they absolutely refuse to see them as lines. They absolutely insist that the lines of the hand are formed by folding, and it's an extraordinary assertion on their part that the lines are formed by the folding action of the hand. So that's all they can see. If and there's a lot of really good arguments as to why they're not. But again, this is why the lines are kind of dismissed, because they're kind of, oh well, they're just folds in the skin. They're not significant at all. They're just like, oh, the hand folds, and it's like a pair of old boots. You get your new boots and then you wear them in, and they get creases in them, and as they get older, they get more and more creases in them. It's just like that. That's the folding action. Well, that's not actually true. I mean, one of my favorite examples of that is if you take an elbow and you fold the elbow. When you fold the elbow, you can see lines forming here, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the folding action of the joint produces little lines in there. But when you open them out,
Gone.
So I mean, from a very simple mechanical view, the folding action of the hands causes the lines to form. That means that when you stretch your hands out, by that argument, there should be no lines on the hand, and yet when you do that, you can see the lines even more strongly. So what's one of the first things that you notice about the lines, to notice about the lines, is that they are not formed by folding, because and it's obvious when you look at handprint. I'm going to get a handprint up. I'm not sure which one I want to get up actually. So this is a line. This is a hand with lots and lots and lots of lines on it, right? So according to the folding theory of lines, this is obviously a very old pair of boots that have been very worn in, and the guy's very old, and he's been wearing his boots a lot. But but you can see whilst you can see that there are certain line formations, like here, which correlate with the joints.
Yeah.
On the phalanges of the fingers. That one doesn't. That one runs right in the middle of. Oh, that one doesn't. There's no fold there. This top section of the finger is not folding where those lines are formed, and moreover, the fingers don't fold that way. Don't fold vertically. So the notion that the lines of the hand are formed by folding falls down on the first observation of the fact that you get lines forming in places where the hand actually doesn't fold at all. And these are good examples of that. So that's a really important thing. That's a really important consideration to take into account. However, this notion that the more lines you have on your hand is to do with aging and so on and so forth. Well, that's completely not true. This is the hand of a 20-year-old. And so what becomes apparent is the number of lines of the hand have nothing to do with your age. This is a 30-year-old. And you can see, look, I mean, there's hardly any lines on this hand at all. There's just the main line formations that we can see on the hand. So the lines are not a product of activity.
I mean, that's just incredible. That one, isn't it? That the previous one, I mean, you actually got something everywhere. I mean,
yeah.
Aside from the fact that the major ones are so weak, they've got no real. They don't stand out very well at all, do they? They're lost in.
Well, that's the thing. That's well observed, Andrew. That's the thing I think that makes this most problematic, is that the main lines are weak as, or in arguably weaker than the subsidiary lines, because they're very broken up. They're very unclear. They're very.
And yet
full of islands and chains.
The sun line is really, that what we would call that to do with the sun. Yeah, very, very outstanding. It's the thing that sort of pings, isn't it? It's the first.
Yeah. But that shouldn't be the strongest line on the hand. I mean, that's the thing. If you look at this hand, I mean, those lines are very, very strong. And very, very clear. And it's a he's a healer and he's a massage therapist, and he works with his, or used to work with his hands, when he was younger. Um, so you get a kind of clarity of a hand in people who are manual workers and physical workers, and you get lots of line forms forming in people who are not like that. I'm going to show you the next handprint. I'm going to show you, this handprint is not one I took. This is a handprint from Beryl Hutchinson's book Your Life in Your Hands. So this is a handprint of somebody who's had electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. And what you see here is the complete dispersion of lines all across the hand. Well, you can see the main lines. They have integrity. They've got better main lines than the last guy. But what you can see is all the millions of lines all over the hand, and lots of dots in the lines too. But it's a really good example of the effects of ECT on the hand. Whereas this person here, this is a handprint from Charlotte Wolf's collection of a catatonic schizophrenic. Wow. So a catatonic schizophrenic is someone who's mentally inactive. There's no cerebral activity going on in that person at all. And I want to particularly point out to you the significance here. Can you see how there's absolutely no lineation on the fingers whatsoever?
Yeah.
Okay. So the main lines are all there, but there's absolutely nothing going on any of these digits. So one of the things that's indicative of, if this is representative of catatonic schizophrenia. Now, catatonic schizophrenia is like, neurologically the brain's not working, there's nothing happening, the lights are on but no one's home, they're physically alive. There was that film with De Niro and Robin Williams called Awakenings in the 90s, which was all about this guy. De Niro was the patient, and Robin Williams was the psychiatrist who had these catatonic schizophrenics, and they woke up. He found out a way of waking them up. It's based on a true story, but that's what they're like. They're just not there at all. They're just not present. There's no activity going on. So what you've got then in comparison is here. There's a lot going on. So this is actually the handprint of a university student who was at Oxford University in 1986. So he's doing philosophy and philosophy, politics and economics. I don't know what's happened to him subsequently, but as a young man, he was obviously a very anxious man and insecure, but he obviously was thoughtful and analytical, and reading books and studying and using his brain. A lot of mental activity going on here. And that's the contrast we want. So the thing we do know for sure is that there's something in the lines of the hand that basically show us that the lines had something to do with the activity of consciousness and the activity of the brain, because we find lots and lots of examples where there are no lines in the hand or few lines in the hand for the case where the people are not thinking things, don't think a lot about things, and places where there's lots of lines in the hand where they are. This is from Fred Getting's book, The Book of the Hand. This is the hand of a farmer. Again, you've got the same simplicity of structure. He's got a lot more stress lines than the catatonic. I mean, if you look at the activation lines, you can see he's got activation lines on the finger phalanges. He's got some here. He's got some here. You can see the vertical lines, right? It's not very good print. And he's got lines here too. All right, so he's got quite a lot of lineation on his hand.
Probably there's not a lot of flexibility in the hand. That's why they couldn't get it like rolled and printed very. Very sort of
maybe, but I think you're right. But it's like you can see he's got some lines on the hand. That's fine. Whereas this guy's got nothing. He also doesn't have anything on the ball of the thumb. There's absolutely no lineation on the ball of the thumb. So so this is so much simpler. His consciousness is so much more simplified. I mean, to have the argument, as many people do, oh, few lines is good, few lines is spiritual, and many lines is bad, palmistry nonsense. Few lines means you're a catatonic schizophrenic. You're basically going to be hospitalized and unable to function as a human being. It's actually quite healthy to have a good balance of lines in your hand and not have no lines at all. As I said, I mean, we look at this hand and go, oh, that's a really simple hand. It hasn't got hardly any lines on it at all. But compared to the catatonic, he's actually got lots of lines in areas of the hand that we would expect to see them here and on the finger phalanges. So one of the things that becomes clear is, to be a functioning human being requires having some degree of lineation in the hand. So this notion that lines are, it's important to have no lines at all on your hand is not true. So the question then becomes, well, what are the lines if they're not formed by folding? And you know and the argument really is this, well, if the scientists are observing simian lines in the hands of Down syndrome, well, clearly they can't be formed by folding. The very fact that the simian line only occurs in about 1 to 2% people normally, but it occurs in 55% of cases with people with genetic chromosomal disorders, is almost the most overwhelming evidence you could have that the lines are formed by some mechanism of genetics. Because they are aberrant incredibly commonly in the hands of people with genetic disorders, particularly Down syndrome. Maybe I can show you some. Maybe I can show you some of those. That might.
Are there any good studies where they've actually taken like a number of handprints with the same person, very well documented ones, where they've done like across, say, 2 or 3 years, and looked to see, you get this thing where the minor lines can get stronger, get weaker, even move slightly, or the major lines, like sort of tributaries, that coming off of them can change, but the general flow of them tends to stay. I mean, I've not seen anything dramatically change. We're always taught Ayurvedically they're like rivers. They will move, but they take a long time to change. Whereas the sort of tributaries will retract and expand and grow, and you might get extra things appear. But is there a really good study where you can actually see, yes, those lines have really changed over a period of a year, or there's virtually no change at all? It's, how quickly are these things actually changing?
The answer to the question is yes, and I have done that study.
Okay. And so what was your conclusion? I mean, what if you're just summing up basically?
The lines are very difficult to change.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll go down that road for now, and we'll come back to simian lines in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really good question, Andrew. And in fact, the best way to answer that really is to get a handprint up, and I'll just do that first.
There's just one thing I would add to that, which we were talking earlier about the fatalistic medieval, and you were saying, like crosses were really bad. That's probably not so true in the Indian system, whereas the symbols, most of the symbols have good connotations. They're not bad. And that's because you're less likely to see them. So like a moon symbol, like the crescent moon seen in the moon area would be like the moon was giving you something. So Chandra gives you beauty, it gives you like softness, it gives you health. There's lots of things that the moon is good for. So generally,
clearly that's a difference between Christianity and Hinduism. Like Christianity is eternally pessimistic and we're all going to die and go to hell. So if clearly it's bad news. Clearly that's a function of the way that they view the world. The thing I will say about that, and that's an important thing to understand about that approach. It's no different from tea leaf reading. Or scapulimancy, or aeromancy, looking at clouds and making divination from that, and using the symbolic, intuitive approach, like seeing symbols in things and having an intuitive rapport with things, And it's like, I'm not, but people should be quite clear, I'm not dismissing that, because there's an intuitive relational position that we all have with the universe, which can be defined as mystical. My problem with that is it's not verifiable and it's not reproducible. It's very individual, very idiosyncratic, and you might see one marking in one person's hand which is indicative of something powerfully symbolic for that individual, and it has absolutely no relevance to anybody else whatsoever, because the nature of intuition is it's very particular to the situation, circumstances, and the moment in which those things come together. If you draw an astrological chart of that moment, it's a wonderful encapsulation of what's happening in that particular dynamic between a person and the situation. And certainly there's a chance that those things can leap out of the hand in that kind of way. I mean, I've seen Neptunian symbols in the hand, I've seen Vajras in the hand. You can see that, and I'm not saying they're insignificant, but I wouldn't base a system of hand reading upon it. And because the thing is, they are individualized and they are particularized, and you can't generalize from them. That's the problem. And so you then have to learn thousands and thousands of meanings of all. It's a bit like it's like getting one of those books which says the meaning of, the meaning of everything you see in a dream. If you see a duck, it means this. If you see a wolf, it means this. If you see, you're like, you've seen those kind of books, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
the meaning, it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same idea as that, and that actually is an insult to the plasticity and imaginative, intuitive qualities of the universe itself, and how that interfaces with human consciousness.
Mm.
That's not, or it's based on imagination. That's not based on intuition, and you have to be able to discern, I think, between those qualities. But even if you got to that, you can't teach that. That's to do with a sort of equanimity or centering within that person that they have to do for themselves. That isn't taught by studying hand reading or studying Ayurveda or studying astrology. That's a completely different thing. And so that's why Cairo's book is not. You can't learn how to read hands from reading Cairo's book, because I mean, assuming, let's take it for a minute, that he was actually the sort of psychic seer that he claimed he was, and many people attested to that. He didn't do it from the hand. He
Yeah,
says
they're
so
more
in
like
the book.
examples of outstanding things, aren't they? It's this is what I saw, and this is what, but it's not reproducible, is it? It's just something
Yeah,
that
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
intuitive.
So exactly, and so if we want hand reading to be taken seriously, we have to make something reproducible. We have to have something that's a systematic thing that works. You know. So to go back to your question about the lines,
Mm.
because it's really important to understand that the lines change over time. And I've got a nice handprint for you here. All right. So do the lines of the hands change over time? Yes, they do. Do they change much over a period of time? Well, yes and no. This handprint, I've included this handprint in my book on dermatoglyphics, so people want to study it, they can look at it in their own book. This is only 13 years apart. 13 years apart, you can actually see the number of changes in the lines really quite easily. So the main thing we should concern us is with the major lines. The subsidiary lines change all the time. I mean, you can look, for example, that little marking there has appeared there, wasn't there that before. That line was there, is appeared there, that wasn't there before. Lots of little lines like that are going to come and go. I'm not too worried about them. You can see there's probably more lines in that area of the hand there. So the subsidiary lines, the more superficial lines of the hand, they come and go quite quickly. What's interesting in this hand is the major lines have changed quite dramatically. So you've got the air line or head line coming across the hand here, sort of forming like that and like that, and with a bit of a fork like that. And then in this hand,
Yeah, wow, that's a big
all the way down there.
difference, isn't it?
Yeah. This line up here goes there, and this time it's changed direction and it goes like that. And this whole area has changed, so that line there has changed, so it's got a little fork on the end of it, and it's going up there. You can see the structure of the heart line has changed. So what we've got here is we've got an island, and it's got
More like roots on that side, isn't it?
yeah, like a chevron. I always think of it as a chevron. So even that line there has changed. That was Wall One Island before, and it's sort of broken up slightly. So the detail of the lines change.
Mm.
Lines get longer. Lines get shorter. There's another interesting line here. So you've got to look at the faint line coming up the hand here, and it goes to about there. And on this hand, it only goes about there.
Yeah.
So lines get longer, lines get shorter, lines appear, lines disappear, lines form, lines don't.
And how long
form.
was that between the two? You said 15 years?
13 years.
13
That's
years.
13 years. Yeah, 13 years. So the lines of the hands can change quite dramatically over time. I wonder if I got another one in this particular example. No. Oh, here we go. So this is a guy who had his handprints taken in 1950.
Yeah.
And again in 1991. So wow. This is 41 years apart.
Well, it almost looks like the one on the right looks a bit like the guy that had the electrotherapy treatment.
Well, yeah, it does a little bit, except he's old. He's 70 years of age in the handprint on the right. So when you study the lines of the hands of old people, that's what they look like. He's got very characteristic things you see in the hands of elderly people are lineation on the top flange of the thumb, much more lineation on top flanges of the fingers, and usually a lot of lineation in the water quadrant as in the hypothetical area as well. And so that's so when you study the handprints of, you know, you look at the hand of a dozen older people, say 70 and above, they all have those kind of features on the hands.
When would you start to see those lines on the fingertips start to appear? Then when do they become
In
more
the hands
common?
of women at menopause.
Right.
I did a study on this about 5 years ago, because I've been doing hand reading since 1983. I was back in the UK in 2018 and 2019, and I went to visit lots of people who I had taken the handprints of in the 80s. My sister's friends, family friends, people like that I'd known for all that time. I got about a dozen handprints of people whose handprints I took in like 1984 or 1985, and then took again in 2018 or 2019. So I've got a good collection. I've got about 30 handprints now, of collections of handprints have taken 30 to 35 years apart.
Wow.
And what was interesting in the case of the hands of the women, in six of the women, they went to university, so they were middle class people. They went to university, they got educated, they got a professional job, they had a professional career, they got married, they had children. When I took their handprints, they were in their early 20s. When I took the handprints again in 2018, 2019, they were still married to the same partner, still doing the same job. They've had a 30-year career, been living in the same house for 25 years. Basically, lots and lots of things in their life had stayed very consistent. And so the line changes in the hand weren't very dramatic, but what they all shared was lineal changes on the top phalanges of the fingers.
Right. Interesting.
And they were all now women in like between 52 and 57, having been between 22 and 27 30 years earlier. So they'd all basically all gone through menopause. And so one of the things I am absolutely clear about is that the lineation on the top phalange of the fingers relates to endocrinological and hormonal changes, and that was particularly graphically demonstrated in this particular study. That study, by the way, I presented that at a conference that Frank Clifford organised in 2021, and there's a video copy of that which is on my YouTube channel and also on my Patreon too. But on my YouTube channel you can watch that if you want to see the whole study. But I basically did a comparative study of about 30 handprints and worked out what changes occur in the hands. And the most common changes are all these little subsidiary lines, and what you can see in this hand here is you get all the changes in the hands that occur as a result of aging. So these are particularly to do with aging, but also can you see the hepatica, the mercury line, the little finger longitudinal line that's appeared there? And you can see he doesn't have one in the hand. You know, and I think that's a function of his ill health. You know, he's in the handprint on the left, you've got a strong, fit, physically able 29-year-old male, and in the right hand you've got the effects of the degeneration of aging. And the minor air line, or the hepatica, the mercury line, the little finger longitudinal, is often indications of digestive disorders and problems with and health problems in general. It's why it's called the health line. And so that's a kind of dramatic thing that's appeared on his hand. But that's not the only change. You know, the changes in his hands the same as the other guy over a 13-year period. So you can see this line here has got a lot weaker. This line, the head line, has got a lot longer. It's kind of got a sort of fork on the end of it.
Yeah. Is there anything you sort of assign to, like, well, you get that bifurcated ends where they sort of split and they form forks or tridents? Is there any kind of universal way that you might look at that? Is that telling you anything specific? If you see a line suddenly, it used to end in a straight bit, but now it's a fork, or is that of any greater interest for you line wise? Yes.
I've done a study on that as well, Andrew.
I'm sure you got a study for every line on that.
No, I mean, not all of them, but I happen to have. You've just picked out two questions I happen to have done a study on. Yeah, I did about 1991, 92. I did a study on the headline, the airline, and what can change the airline. The most significant thing for changing an airline is education and meditation. I actually, the study I did was on the hands of people on a meditation course, and it was a year-long course. I took the handprints before, I took the handprints after, and on average, the airline had grown at least half a centimeter in every case, minimum on average. Some of them it grew 2 centimeters, some of them it grew a few millimeters, but the average was half a centimeter across 25 participants in this course.
Mm.
So one of the things that can increase your airline is meditation. Is to do with insight and understanding. You know, that's the thing we know this about this airline, because if you look at the hand of the Dalai Lama, we all think is a very intelligent, wise person. His airline goes down here.
Mm.
So the long airline that droops down into that area of the hand is a function of a kind of insight and understanding into the nature of the world, which could be a product of meditation, or it could be a product of study and reflection and analysis, or both of them, perhaps, probably in the case of the Dalai
Well,
Lama.
that would sort of feed nicely back into that idea about the lifeline as well, wouldn't it? Because Ayurvedically, we're always taught to try and cultivate a life of patience and peace, and ultimately all these things increase longevity. You know, the more restless, the more aggravated, the more angry you get, and the shorter the life, because you're kind of burning up all that. You're creating more fire, more conflict, more likely to fall into harm's way, you know, conflicts and stuff like that. So
I mean that's true. I think, I mean, the only example I've got of a headline that's missing is in the hand of a man who was rather foolhardy and took lots of risks and didn't think things through, you know. So but on the question of that again, look at the lifeline in his hand, you know. So the lifeline in his hand is really strong in
mm,
his hand
mm,
when he's 29,
yeah.
and yet when he's 70, it sort of ends there, you know. It runs out.
Okay.
According to the palmistry books who time the lines, his lifeline ran out when he was 75. You know, there's 40, there's 60. Oh yeah, you know, he's still alive, but he should have run out years ago. So the length of the lifeline has got nothing to do with the length of the life. It's got to do with health and vitality, I think. And I would suspect that this guy's got colonic cancer or something like that. I don't know. I'm speculating, but you've got lots of indications in his hand where there's stasis and blockage and digestive dysfunction, and particularly I would, with that area, when that area of the earth line or the thenar line is weak, it's usually, or problematic, it's usually a problem with the intestine, and at the bottom of that, it's usually the large intestine. So, you know, he's got a lot of constipation in the hand. There's a lot of stagnant energy in his hand, you know, which is kind of indicative of that kind of condition, precancerous kind of condition, I suppose you could call that. The most obvious ways in which they change to do with health. So you can see changes in the lines of the hand over a matter of months. If someone's really ill and then they get better, you'll see changes in the lines of the hand, depending on the condition, obviously. But I mean, I've seen the quickest I've seen is 7 months. So that's, you know, a 6 month period is probably fairly short, really. But over the long term, you can see the impact, for example, of hormonal changes, endocrinological changes. You can see the impact, as we just saw there, of medication and the impact it has on the body. As we saw in the other handprint, just the general aging and degeneration process that occurs. So the lineation of the hand reflects, and stress levels. Another really obvious one is stress levels. The subsidiary line, the little lines on the hand, come and go quite quickly according to the levels of stress you're under. I mean, I've got my handprints. When I'm 20, my hand's completely empty because I'm like carefree and like, whoa, you know, just rolling along. And in my 30s, they got stress lines all over them because I'm stressed to buggery. And a bit better now because I'm retired, you know. But it's like, you know, the stress levels come and go and the lineation comes and go. But in terms of the main lines of the hand, they're very, very difficult to change. So the first handprint that we looked at, where the airline grew like 2 inches, that's an incredible thing. It's very rare to see that amount of change that's happened by concerted effort. Everything else I've just mentioned is happenstance. Stress levels, external factors; illness, external factors; hormonal changes, well, they're not under your control; aging, that's not under your control. So lots of things can happen to your hands, changes that are not changes you kind of chose to make, if you like. It's really difficult to make changes in your hands by virtue of the effort that you make and the choices that you make in your life. And so that is rarer indeed. But that doesn't matter for the general argument that we're talking about, because what matters is, do the lines change? If the lines change, then the lines are not put there by God. The lines have not been put there as a manifestation of your destiny. They're
Mm.
not like God leaving his mark in your hand, or your fate is, and it's not written in your hands in that sense. The choices are yours. So the view that people have that you can do prediction on the lines of the hand is predicated upon the fact that they think, or they assume, that the lines don't change. Once you know that the lines change, once you know that, it's impossible to predict how they're going to change, and therefore it's impossible to predict anything from the lines of the hand. Because if you're looking at the lines for markings and events and so on, if the lines change, then you might see a marking that says, oh, in 20 years time, when you're 53, you're going to have an accident or whatever. Well, that line that you saw when they were 25 that said that may not be there in 23 years time, because the lines of the hands change. And so if the lines, once you understand that the lines of the hands change, then it's quite clearly they're not showing off fate, and it's quite clear it's impossible to do prediction from the lines of the hand. And so then that brings us back to the question then, well, what do the lines show then? What are they? And that's the question, but I think is really important. And what's your view? What do you think the lines show? Is what in the tradition you're
I
in?
mean,
What
I
do
was
they
just
show?
thinking while you were just talking about that, I was still because I obviously I'm interested in the iridology as well, and that's a similar
Mm.
kind of thing where we're taking a body part, we're making an analysis from it. So you have your constitutional model where it's pretty much set, like the fingerprints, it doesn't really change, but things are
Yeah.
added to it which can change the outcome. You can see like the adaptation of colors, the forming of certain rings. So I tend to think of
Yeah.
it a little bit like that. Like the major lines are there is some kind of like that's the constitutional base, but I see the
Right.
minor lines as adaptations, and how those adaptations then reflect back and modify the primary lines. In some ways it's a map, and in some ways it's a dashboard. It kind of shows you both depending on how you approach it.
Totally. I know. I look, and I think you've made a very important distinction there between the different. I'm just going to draw up ping up another picture. So we started with this one earlier on with our paradigm neutral
Yeah.
nomenclature.
Is this going to become the
Um,
new standard? Do you think everyone's going to
well,
adopt?
I'm thinking about it. I'm really thinking about it. We've got a conference. We've got a handreading conference coming up in October, and I think I'm gonna think about it between now and then. But I suspect this is going to be the new way forward, because if you're going to have lots of hand readers getting together, you've got to have a language that everybody can share, and and then, as I
Do you
say,
know,
it's getting it.
I find this the biggest stumbling block because I mean I love what you're doing and I love what Johnny's doing and all of this, but the elemental thing, because it's kind of
Yeah,
backwards. I find that I really have to get my head around it because you're sort of
yeah,
saying air, and I'm
yeah, yeah,
thinking,
yeah.
a minute, it's the
Yep.
opposite.
No, exactly. I mean, you have to become. It's like being fluent in. You have to become fluent in lots of languages. That's what I think of it. All right. So we've got various line formations on the hand. So we've got the major lines, which we've been talking about the three main lines of the headline, the heart line, and the lifeline, just to use the conventional nomenclature. Those three. Those are the three main lines. So that one we all agree. So and those are the lines are the ones that don't change very much, which is why I showed you that handprint. I said look at the main lines, because they're the one. It's the subsidiary lines change all the time, but the main lines don't. The minor lines, they're all are located on the on the hypothenar area of the hand, basically. And these are quite variable, and of course not everybody has these lines. So
Mm,
it's quite good to consider the lines in terms of like these three levels. And then there's the subsidiary lines, which are all the little stress lines and the markings and forks and breaks and all those sorts of things that we get. These are much more superficial, and they can change. They can change all the time. So
mm,
they're not. So it's important to understand how lines. There are different qualities of lines. They represent sort of different layers, and then things like the markings on the lines, like we saw with that handprint where he had an island at the beginning of the heart line and it turned into the chevrons.
yeah.
Even the structure of a line can change, like the internal structure of a line can change. So the lines can change really quite dramatically. So it's important to understand the different layers of the lines. So this brings us back to this brings us back to the somebody with Down syndrome. This is a Down syndrome handprint.
Mm.
So what's important to know about the Down syndrome hand is that that basically there some of the line features, some of the hand features are very specifically associated with Downs. And one of the most characteristic that we've been talking about vis-a-vis the lines is, of course, the simian line formation, which you can see quite clearly on here. And on this hand, you can see that all the three lines are well formed, except on this hand, this is what medical science calls a Sydney line, because it's an airline that goes right across the hand. Actually, this very example proves Aristotle is completely wrong. Do you remember what we talked about with Aristotle? And he said, "Oh well, why is it that people with transverse lines that cut right across the hand are so long-lived, and why are people without such lines not so long-lived?" Well, as you could see in both this person's hand, we got a transverse line that cuts right across the hand. And one of the things that's known about people with Down syndrome is they don't live very long. No. It's characteristic. You don't see very many elderly people with Down syndrome. They have congenital heart defects, and most of them die before the age of 30. Occasionally people that live longer, but the longevity, because it's a major chromosomal disorder, you know, it's a genetic condition that causes all sorts of complications. Obviously, they're cognitively impaired, but they are born with congenital heart conditions, and the congenital heart condition is actually indicated by the displaced axial triradius, which you can see here. If you look at the triradius in the palm, so the axial triradius is displaced into this position. So this is in medical science, that was the most significant factor in the hand of a Down syndrome. It was not the simian line actually, but the displaced axial triradius. What was interesting about that particular studies from the dramatic living point of view was the displaced axial triradius was also extremely common in studies that were done into congenital heart conditions when they were considering heart disease. There's plenty of papers studied in the 60s and 70s looking into biometric markers of congenital heart disease, and the displaced axial triradius came first of all the results that they had. So you've got two completely different studies, one doing Down syndrome saying, oh look, people with Down syndrome have displaced axial triradius, and another one going, oh look, we found the most common thing that indicating congenital heart disease is displaced axial triradius. Oh, well that's funny because the Down syndrome also had congenital heart disease as well. So there's a very strong corroboration about the medical significance of this particular pattern.
Is that the same if you've got a simian line and there's no Down syndrome? Are they still subject to shorter lives, heart problems? Have you ever found that to be true?
That's not what the scientific literature shows. No, you're right. So what they found basically was you can't assess Down syndrome on the basis of one thing and one thing alone. Having a simian line is not pathognomic of Down syndrome, but having a simian line in conjunction with a displaced axial triradius, an increased on the loop patterns, a short little finger, and a rudimentary thumb, which you can see in all of these handprints are great examples because you can see that thumb is really short. You can see the little finger is really short. It's also bent. It's got clinodactyly. I'm not going to show them now, but all the fingerprint patterns are loops. You know, loops occur about 60% of fingerprint patterns in Down syndrome. It's about 85% of fingerprints are loop patterns, which is why Down syndrome get dementia, because they've got loops which are associated with dementia, plus the displaced axial triradius, plus the simian line. You know, so to make a diagnosis of Down syndrome from the hand requires the combination of all those factors. Like even the dramatic physicists are following William Benham's edict of don't follow one thing alone. It's all matter of combination. You've got to combine this with that and the other. You've got to look at a multiplicity of factors. However, what is important, and which is what I was going on to say to address your question about constitution, is that the simian line is very, very common in the hands of people with Down syndrome. And Down syndrome is a genetic condition. Therefore, what's clear is that the major lines are in fact constitutional. because they show something. They're the clear genetic determination of these lines, and moreover, you can actually see that by studying the hands of in a family. If you study the father and the son, or the mother and the daughter, you'll find replications of lines in that go from one hand to the other. So basically, lines can be inherited. Basically, that's a good way of thinking about it.
Mm.
Or if you look at it, I'm going to just get up another handprint now. If you look at the hands of twins, I mean, that's another. If you start looking at genetic cases, it becomes immediately apparent that the lines are genetic. When you see a pair of twins, you basically grab them and say, "I'm going to give you a free hand reading." The lines that are the same are fairly obvious to see. Like you can see, the water line has got very much the same form to it. The heart line, the air line is kind of got this funny wiggle in the middle of it there. It's got a funny wiggle in there like that. But then her one kind of goes on. So the airline is quite different. And they both got that sort of branch that goes off there like that. So that's sort of the same. So the airline's very different, but the water line is incredibly the same. And the earth and the lifeline, or the earth line, is also incredibly the same.
Yeah. Look at the top
What's
flange of
that?
the little finger as well. Look, identical lines almost on those
Yeah.
top of the little.
Yeah. Yeah. These two little lines here. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not too worried about the subsidiary lines, Andrew. Don't worry too much about the
Okay, no,
fingerprints and
just it pinged out
lines on the
like that
fingers,
for some
because
reason.
yeah, but those change all the time. Those are to do with stress, and that's but the major lines are constitutional.
Okay.
So the fact that there's so much similarity in the major lines in two people who are unique physical people but genetically identical.
Yeah.
And look at that, we have almost identicality in the lineation of the hand, and that's to me that shows that the one of the important ways to understand the lines of the hand is that they have a genetic component, and it's like, and that's not just my opinion. That's kind of really borne out by 100 years of medical scientific literature. So what I was saying earlier on is like the scientists study fingerprint patterns, but they have to include looking at the lines because they've got such obvious examples of simian lines where in Down syndrome where they can't mistake it, they can't overlook it really, because they're so characteristic and so distinctive. And yet when you start looking at other things that would show genetic basis for that, like the pair of twins, it's quite clear that a large amount of the lines have a sort of genetic component to them. Now, what we'd expect to see that, because obviously one of the things that the lines show, they show similar constitutions, or they show certain things to do physiologically, but they also show things psychologically. And that's the characteristic thing about twins, is that they share a great deal of things, not only in terms of their physical appearance, but psychologically alike. And those studies where they've done twins that were separated from birth, and then they meet each other when they're 53, and they're both married to a woman called Mary, both drive a white car, but one lives in Larchwood Avenue and the other one lives in Larchwood Crescent. They both, whatever, these extraordinary coincidences between their two lives, which have been anecdotally recorded, but nonetheless really striking. So the lines must show something psychological as well, and but that psychology is based upon our body, because if nothing else, the hands are a function of our physical being and our body. They are expressions of our body. The hand shapes that we have is a product of our physiological shape and size. If you're tall and thin, you have tall, thin hands. If you're short and fat, you have short, fat hands. So there's a biological component into that for certain. There's a genetic component in terms of the fingerprint patterns. And then there's obviously an individual psychology. When you're looking at the hands of twins, you can look at the similarities between the hands, but then look at the differences. And the differences will tell you something about, well, where their personalities are in fact different. But I think the reason we can consider that the lines are to do with personality and an expression of human consciousness, there's two arguments for that really. The first argument is neurological. So we saw earlier on, we saw the handprints of the stressed out student as compared to the catatonic schizophrenic. And then we saw the hands of the woman who'd had electroconvulsive therapy and how the lines were completely dissipated by that. So what that's a function of is electrical activity in the nervous system. Same thing with the epileptic. Too much electrical activity in the nervous system produces an overload in that system. So there's something about the delineation of the hand reflects our neurological activity. And here's the thing that really I think is underlies that very, very strongly, and that is that the lines of the hand form in the fetus between the 9th and the 12th week of gestation.
Mm.
Now, that's really, really important. So that's the third month. At that time, the fetus is 2.5 centimeters long. The fetus is tiny,
Mm.
so it's growing. It's growing little buds on the end of its hands. And as the fingers form, before the fingers are really clearly formed, you can actually see the lines on the hand. So embryologists have studied fetuses, aborted fetuses usually, and looked at them under a microscope, and they've mapped out exactly what happens in every day of every week during the fetal development. And that's how we know that. There's been lots of scientific studies that have been done. I've actually got an appendix on this in my book on fingerprints, so
Mm.
people can refer to it
Is
there
that
if
the
they want
same
to
with the
read.
can the fingerprints be found that early as well? Even the fingerprints?
No, no, no.
Yeah.
I'll come
Okay.
to the
Sorry.
fingerprints in a matter. They're actually later, but the lines form between the 9th and the 12th week of gestation. Now, at that stage, the hand is just the kind of there's no bone in there. There's some gelatinous things that are going to form the bones, some
Mm.
ligaments, if you like, some cartilage, but and the blood supply, but there's no muscle in the hand. There's actually no physical muscle. There's nothing in the
Nothing
hand
to
that can make the
contract.
hand move. It
Yeah.
just can't move. And in fact, the first spontaneous fetal hand movement isn't recorded until the 23rd week. In other words, 10 weeks after the lines are already formed. So the
Mm.
lines are already there before the hands can move,
Mm.
which basically means that the hands fold where the lines are. It's not that the lines form because of where the hands are folding, it's the other way around. It's the fold lines come first, if you like, and then that's where the hand folds because the folds have already been. If you've got a piece of paper and you've already put a crease in it and you put it on the table, it will fold where you've already put the crease.
Mm.
Essentially the same idea. But what's particularly interesting is that between the 9th and the 12th week of gestation, that's when the nervous system is being laid down in the body. And so the neural pathways are connecting the hand and the brain at the very same time as the lines are forming on the hands themselves.
Mm.
And so that's, I think, is the most coherent argument as to what causes the lines. It's something to do with the neurological activity of consciousness as it's creating this physical form of the body. And we know about the nerve endings between the hand and the brain because there are more nerve endings connecting the brain to the hand and the brain in any other part of the body, both sensory nerves in terms of touch and feel, but also the motor nerves in terms of what we do. And if you get that picture of a homunculus, you get those absolutely enormous hands and tiny little back and tiny little kneecaps, but huge hands and huge feet and huge lips, because but the hands are by far and away the biggest things because the nerve endings that are going there. So the neural connection between the brain and the hand, I think, is a really important argument as to what causes the lines of the hand, that they're formed by the neurological activity of the brain. So in a kind of literal way, you could think of the lines of the hand as sort of a printout of your brain.
Mm.
Or a print, or better, maybe a printout of the neural pathways that have been habituated.
Mm.
Probably slightly better. Which again is like saying, can people change their habits? Well, yeah, they can. But once you've laid down certain neural pathways, it's quite difficult to change the habits, and people get stuck in particular habits. So, but is it possible to rewire your brain? Well, yes, obviously that happens, and people do that. But in terms of how easy is it, it's pretty difficult.
Well, you were sort of saying that. I was thinking back to the Ayurvedic principle that, so for instance, the lifeline for Ayurvedically for us would be Pitru Rekha as well, like the father's lineage. The airline or the headline would be
Mm-hmm.
Matri Rekha, which is mother's lineage.
Yeah,
So Ayurvedically, the father controls or the bone and the structure and the actual structure and strength of the body. The
yeah,
mother's line is more to do with the organs and the sort of systems that form within that. So the interplay of those two is really important, how those two play out. And so, you're looking at sort of traits coming from the father's side, traits coming from the mother's.
So that's also interesting as well. So, then the argument comes. Then now I'm arguing this, recognizing that what I've just presented to you is a kind of biological determinism, a sort of scientific materialistic explanation of consciousness, that consciousness somehow resides in the nervous system and in the brain. Well, arguably it doesn't, so that's another kind of question again. So one thing I think is useful to think about with the lines of the hand is, because there's a kind of interrelationship between the lines of the hand and the dermatoglyphics on the hand as well, because they do go together, the way I like to think of the dermatoglyphics, I like to think of the fingerprint patterns as the effects of consciousness on the body. So if you think, we talked about this last time about the way that the sea leaves an impression on the beach and kind of creates these eddies and marks and that. So the ridges are kind of like a function of the way consciousness has impressed itself upon the physical body. But what's interesting, I think, also is, if you look at this, is if you put the lines on the hand, I mean, that's a fairly typical drawing of the ridge lines on the palm. But you can see that with that line there, the major earth line is going to go around here. The CNR crease is going to go around there. And what's interesting is that it doesn't cross this triadus line. So there's a triadus at the bottom of the palm, and it goes right up the center of the palm like that. And the line stays within that boundary. And the same for the heart line. The heart line starts over here, and it stays within that boundary. It doesn't cross the triradius here. So this triradius always sits there, and it runs a ridge line going down across that part of the hand there. And then the air line, the head line, runs sort of in that middle space like that. So it can often go down in that sort of direction like that. So, but what's interesting about that is the lines formed first. So the skin ridges actually work their way around where the lines already are.
Same with the palm prints, as the palm prints are the same. They'll form around the same time with the fingerprints. So the lines form first, and then the palm prints.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's like you say, it's the opposite, isn't it? It's like that sort of Victor Schauberger thing about fish are swum, birds are flown. It's not actually the actual thing that's doing the moving. It's the energetic around them which is actually having the effect.
That's a really good way of thinking about it. It's kind of opposite of what you think, and it must be that way because chronologically the lines form first and the fingerprints come second. So that's I mean that blows my mind a bit. It's hard to get your head around exactly how it works. But anyway, those are the facts. If those are the facts, then we have to change the way we see things according to that. And so, as you say, birds are flown, and and
that's what that environment produces. In that environment, it would cause things to fly because that's the energetic of the. Wow, amazing, really interesting.
Yeah. So it's kind of, but nonetheless, what we also see is that when the lines change, what they typically do is they change in alignment with the ridges. So. But I've seen this in my own hand. I've seen this in other people's hand. When you see, for example, we talked about the air line growing. Because if it's like starts there, if you're looking at the ridge lines of the palm, they're obviously a bit closer together than this. But what you tend to notice is that where the line starts growing, it starts kind of pushing out between two ridges, and you can kind of see where a line's going to grow. But there's an interaction between the ridges, the dermatoglyphic ridges, and the line as well. So the lines, they're definitely interactive like that. The lines don't really cross the ridges because the ridges are laid second, but when they grow and they change, they tend to come out through the furrows of the ridges of the skin ridges.
So you're saying that basically there is scope for them to develop, but always within the given framework. There's no way, for instance, that a lifeline could suddenly grow up to the little finger because that's
It's not going to go. It's not going to start going towards the wrist, and it's not going to go. I think I've got there. not like in those amazing Edwin Salter 13th century manuscripts that we saw at the beginning, where the lines are going all over the place. They're kind of quite predetermined in their positionings. That's the interesting thing. Now they are the thenar line goes around the thumb, the natural line goes across the middle of the hand, the upper transverse goes up towards the fingers. They're all in the same places, always. That's the hard and fast rule.
Well, I was going to say it's like an athlete, isn't it? Let's say you're physically born with an athletic body that's well capable of achieving these amazing athletic feats, and another person who's an aspiring athlete who isn't born with the same structure. Of course, they can hone what skills they have, but they're always going to be restricted by the fact that they've been born into a body that's not going to
Yeah,
be able to achieve that.
yeah. Absolutely, and a long distance runner isn't built in the same way as a sprinter, or a boxer or a bodybuilder or a weightlifter. And I mean, the Olympics is a very good example of different bodies suit different purposes in that exact way. And if you're a front row forward playing for England, you're not going to run. You're not going to beat the 10 second 100 meters, are you? This is a fact of life. Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. And this is this in effect, what we've got here is the interplay between genetics and neurology. Or if you want, karma and consciousness would be another way you could it as well. I mean, depending on what paradigm you want to use. And like so I often view the lines as being flows of energy as well. I think that's quite an interesting way to look at the lines in terms of energy flows across the hand. And so that's kind of a way which you can think of these lines as flows. I think that's a valuable way of thinking about them. You talked about it earlier on, but the way that the lines flow, they have a particular course. It's like if you've got a river going down a valley, it doesn't turn around and go back up the valley and go over the next into the next one. It can't go over. It can't go over the mountain. What I'm concerned with is, as I said at the beginning, we need to be clear that we're going to get a diagnosis that's right. So if we're looking at the lines of the hand and we're seeing the different degrees of ephemerality in the lines, constitutional, psychological, momentary, change to do with levels of stress changes and stuff like that, we need to consider what the most important ones are, not the most insignificant ones. And when people are looking for signs and symbols in the hands, they're looking for the most fleeting and passing and insignificant ones, and that shouldn't be the priority. The major lines should be at a priority over and above them, and beyond that, the morphogamy of the hand, and in particular the fingerprint pattern, should be first. The things that are consistent in the hand that don't change in the hand are probably going to tell us more about the qualities of that person that are consistent. They're going to be with them for their whole life, and therefore describe much more of their life than the things that are fleeting and the things that are ephemeral. And so my challenge to hand readers out there is to do that, to base your hand reading on that which has priority and that which is important and that which is fundamental. In the same way that if you're doing diagnostics using iridology or Ayurveda, the constitution is fundamental. You can't go, oh look, you've got this funny little symptom on your ear, but what's this constitution? Oh, I didn't worry about that. No, you have to worry about it because that's contextual. That's the context in which the symptom's appearing. And then a symptom in one particular case isn't the problem, where it's very much a problem in some other case because of their constitutional differences. And so it's the same kind of thing. We have to look at what is the sort of psychic constitution. If we're saying that the hand is a function of consciousness, if the hand is an expression of consciousness, what are the fundamental parameters that are at work here? Do we see the hand as an expression of an individual? Do we see the hand as an expression of the soul or energetic of that person? Is it consciousness seeking to manifest itself in the world, or is it just the mark of God or the hand of fate or something like that, or just irreversible genetics? I mean, I don't like my personal preferences. I don't like any of the fatalistic viewpoints at all. It doesn't matter whether it's genetics or God. It's the same kind of problem. What I try to do in the approach that I take to hand reading is empower people by giving them understanding of themselves, so they can understand. They can understand the cards that they've been dealt. The hand reader is there to serve the person and to help the person understand themselves, and they will definitely help them more by helping them understand the pattern rather than telling them that their eyes are going to get poked out by a jumping spittoon out of a fireplace, or they're going to fall off a horse in battle, or whatever. But it's we have to be careful as hand readers. I think we have to be careful with what we do, because so much power is invested in us because of the misunderstanding of what hand reading is, because people think it shows your fate or it shows how God has manifested in your hands, and that somehow you can see the mind of God as God has impressed upon you. And it's like, I say, no, it's not at all like that. I can teach you how to read hands if you want.
Great information. So I think, to sort of wrapping up for people, to get in contact with you and just take this further.
Sure.
So what's happening at the moment? I know you're obviously, the book's coming out beginning of next year, to 2026.
The correct title is The Palmistry of Fingerprints, so I'll just get that right first.
Coming out.
Yeah.
That's January, February next year.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you've got a course coming up. You're doing specialty course on just looking at the lines. Is that's coming up pretty?
Yeah, that's the next thing. That's the next coming up. 21st of September. I'm doing a 4-week deep dive into the lines of the hand and their significance. So anyone who's studied hand reading before can actually join in on that one. There's information about that on my Patreon site. But yeah, that's an open course. But if you haven't studied anything about hand reading at all, you'll probably just about be all right. But it's intense. I mean, they're 3-hour workshops, and there's a lot, we cover a lot of ground. But it's part of a teaching module I do with the International Hand Reading Association. So it's one of the modules for one of their diplomas. But it's going to be all about the lines and really trying to explain what the lines show and how you can actually interpret the lines in a way that's useful. I tend to avoid everything that's speculative, and I only work with the stuff that I have confidence in, not just from my experience, but from experience shared with other hand reading colleagues that I have. And then that's what, and we work together a lot. I mean, that's why we have the conferences. So the second thing to note really coming up is we have the next International Hand Reading Association conference, which is at the end of October, 25th and 26th of October. And typically myself, Johnny Fincham and Felicity Booth all present a paper on our latest researches, things we're interested in doing, and papers that we got coming up about that. So I think we've got some stuff coming up on neurodivergence in the hand, criminality in the hand, and drug addiction in the hand. I think some of those papers are going to come up in this conference. And we always have a special guest. And we have a guy called Andreas Washington who's runs a website called dramaticlyrics.com, where he looks at
a little bit of a nightmare to navigate because there's a hell of a lot of stuff. Yeah. But
I agree. Well, he's going to give us a presentation at the conference, and I've asked him to kind of keep it quite simple. But his approach is basically saying, "Hey, fingerprint patterns are really unusual, and look at this. Some really interesting and unusual people have some really interesting and unusual fingerprint patterns. Maybe there's a correlation between fingerprint patterns and unusual extreme abilities." 100%. So he's been doing that work for 40 years. So we're very privileged to have him coming along. So we try to do that. We kind of open up to people who've got a different approach, and so that we can all learn something. So it's open to the conference is open to anybody who's interested in hand reading. So I'll send you the information.
So there's the line course coming up in September. You've got your IHRA, the Hand Readers Association, coming up in October, and the book comes out in January, February next year, which I'd highly recommend. I saw an earlier iteration of the book, and you very kindly sent me a copy to have a read through. It's fascinating. I really recommend it. It sort of just clears up all the clutter, really. It sort of condenses it down to something that's really easily digestible. So I highly recommend.
Thank you.
So
Thank you, Andrew. And in terms of the handprints that we've been looking today, the changes on the hand, those are handprints in that book.
Okay.
And there's an appendix at the back of the book which talks about the embryogenesis of the lines and quotes all the scientific papers that show the development of the lines during that fetal development stage. So have a look at that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christopher. Appreciate your time.
Andrew, thank you once again. It's always fun talking to you. We have a great time, and we seem to go on for a long time. So I look forward to doing it again sometime, no doubt.